So it's been 10 years now, and I think it's finally time to talk about the full reason why I rejected my full-time offer at Amazon. And I think a good place to start is by reviewing some performance evaluations that my manager wrote about me. So I actually did 2 internships at Amazon. One was during the first 4 months of 2013, and the other one was in the last 4 months of 2013. All right, so let's start reading the performance evaluation. So overall performance summary, and so there's 2 sections here. One is a summary that I wrote, and one is what the manager wrote. I won't read all of my part because it's kind of boring. I just said some fluff about I want to learn on this team and blah, blah, blah. So let's read what my manager wrote. Over the course of Robert's internship on our team, he has shown himself to be a very capable and intelligent software engineer. He will be sorely missed when he leaves our team to go back to school. We enjoyed working with him, and we think Amazon would benefit from offering him a full SDE position on our team once he graduates in a little over a year. Robert's primary focus while working on our team was the internal Redshift operations console, herein referred to as the Ops console. His customers were the SDEs and Ops engineers on the Redshift team. He was tasked with implementing new features and supporting existing ones. Robert has far surpassed my expectations and goals by routinely delivering high-quality features and quickly finding and fixing bugs. And the next part is identify strengths and areas for improvement. And for my part, I said bias for action and some stuff about being customer-obsessed, and the part my manager wrote was ownership. It is obvious that Robert took pride in owning the Ops console. He even spent some of his personal time improving the Ops console in ways that weren't directly asked of him. He substantially improved the time to first byte performance of slow-loading pages in the Ops console by moving certain slow-loading sections into iframes. This dramatically sped up delivery of critical information and has helped our Ops engineers provide better and quicker support for our customers. Customer obsession. Robert involved his customers, Redshift SDEs and Ops engineers, in the development of new features. He is great at driving team discussions to actionable conclusions and finding answers to any ambiguous requirements. Recently, our team was experiencing network-related issues between a few of our production systems, and Robert took it upon himself to add verbose logging to critical sections of the Ops console that were particularly impacted by the networking issue. Now, I remember reading that section at the time, and I'm not really sure what he's talking about. I think he might have actually confused me with another employee. Okay, here's the juicy section, areas for improvement. And it looks like from my summary, I wrote that I could insist on higher standards. I'd like to see Robert become more resourceful instead of waiting for help from someone on the team. In addition to Redshift's codebase, nearly all of Amazon's source code is readily available for all employees to read. Also, there are many useful wikis and email lists that he could reach out to. A mentor's name brought this up with Robert on a few occasions, but we would like to see him work harder in this area. One thing that I remember very vividly about working on that team was there was a certain team member who would take every opportunity he could to try and insinuate very publicly that I just wasn't doing my own research, and a few times it was actually a big barrier to getting information across. I remember in one case, I asked him a very specific question about a piece of code, and the question that I kept asking is, why are we doing this in the code? As in, what is the code trying to accomplish? Why are we doing this in the first place? And every time I would ask this, he would respond by simply explaining algorithmically, from a computer science standpoint, what the code actually did, like variable assignments and things like that. But I kept emphasizing, I want to know, why is the code doing this? Not what does it do? Why is it doing it? And he would always steer the conversation back to just like, oh, you should read the manual for this programming language and stuff, but it's not in the programming language manual. Okay, that's it for one internship, but I have another review here. So here's my second review from my manager. Internship review, Robert Elder. Your first project was to move the Redshift desktop developers control plane admin from one database to another database. You were able to look at how another team did this process and adapt it to our needs. Your performance here is mixed. You did a good job in ensuring that the transition from one database to another was as seamless as it could be. However, you took longer to complete this project than I think you should have, mainly due to overcomplicating the requirements. For example, we do not need to encrypt the database, as the database is a developer's database and does not contain any sensitive information. I think it's interesting that he would lead with that, because that's actually not what I was trying to do. And the story behind that is something I remember very vividly, because it's one of the major reasons I chose not to go back to Amazon. In reality, all I did was ensure that the connection to the database was encrypted. In the context of the work that I was doing with this developer database, there was a wiki guide that I was following, and it described the steps for interacting with this developer database. And in the wiki guide, one of the things it mentioned was making sure the database connection was encrypted. And long story short, all I did was go a few extra steps to find a setting to turn on native encryption for this database connection. Now, that by itself was a pretty unremarkable piece of work. It was something that I only spent maybe a few hours on one afternoon, and it was also an issue that I raised during a stand-up. I asked my colleagues, including my manager, if they knew anything about turning on this encryption setting, but as was typical during stand-up, everyone just stared vegetatively forward and didn't say anything. So I figured, oh, nobody knows, so I'll figure it out myself. Now, the part that I didn't expect was that a couple days later, my manager came up to my desk and absolutely berated me about spending time on turning on this encryption setting. And I actually don't quite remember everything he said to me because he just kind of came out of nowhere and started saying all these things that were really ridiculous and didn't make any sense. He kept insinuating that I was wasting way too much time on this and that I needed to stop it immediately, but this wasn't something I was working on continuously. It was just a setting. I turned the setting on, I verified that it was working, and that was it. And then I moved on. I was already on to working on other things. But despite that, he said I needed to stop working on this, and he just kept going on saying, like, why are you working on this? We don't care about this. Why are you wasting so much time? And eventually I kept listening to him say what he wanted to say, waiting for my turn to speak. And at one point, it almost seemed to me like he was in this fugue-like state where he's just coming up with random things that really questionable statements that don't make any sense. And he kept going on so long, it made me think that he's actually waiting for me to interrupt him. He's not actually going to stop speaking on his own. So that was definitely one of my stranger interactions. So let's continue with the performance review. So as a result of that interaction, the next sentence is, the takeaway here would be for you to clarify requirements to avoid spending time on things which add little value to a project. Your next project was to complete the event subscriptions project. This project was started by a previous intern but left uncompleted. There were significant changes to the requirements, which resulted in you having to do a considerable amount of rework. You clarified the requirements, implemented the changes, and fixed the existing bugs. This feature is now live in production for our customers. Overall, your performance here exceeded the expectations. CS fundamentals. I think you have good CS fundamentals. On many parts of the project, you were able to understand why previous decisions were made and also made sound judgments when solving problems. Your code reviews were generally clean, and there were no visible red flags in data structures and algorithms knowledge. Ownership. The Redshift event subscriptions project was in an odd state when you took over. With some help and instructions, you set up meetings with the project manager and other managers to finalize on the definition. As a part of the project, we were also updating the event text of all events published from Redshift. This was a tedious and time-consuming process. Your attention to detail helped finalize the text across various applications in the Redshift control plane. Deliver results. You were able to complete the project and make it available for public usage before the end of your internship. Our original intent was to make it available at the reInvent AWS user conference. Though due to a couple bugs, the functionality was announced, but not available for use until a few weeks later. Overall, you did a good job to chase down many of the bugs that were both pre-existing and new. You also spent time to track down and fix scenarios where we were incorrectly cutting tickets. All these demonstrated your ability to successfully deliver a product. So the reInvent conference, I have an interesting note about that. I remember at the time they told me that feature specifically is going to be announced as part of the keynote presentation for the entire conference. And they pitched it as though my feature specifically was a major component of what was going to be announced at this entire conference. But later on, I think I actually managed to track down the full presentation. I think it was like an hour and 40-minute long presentation that was on YouTube. And I found the slide where they announced the features that were new to Redshift. And my feature was it's just like a tiny line of text you couldn't even read. And the point of the slide was that there's so many features that were announced on this slide that you couldn't even read any of the text. That's how many features they're releasing. And so from that experience, I've come to think that the AWS reInvent conference might actually just be to kind of have a random milestone, like some goalposts for the employees to get them motivated to say like, hey, you better finish that feature right now because your feature specifically is going to be announced in the keynote presentation. Okay, so that's it for the strengths section. The next is areas for improvement. And then my manager writes, overthink and overcomplicate things. You strive for perfection. This has to be balanced with timely delivery of the product, and is especially important in the fast-moving world of AWS. Your first tendency is to try and get every last requirement nailed down before you move forward with the project. This type of approach can slow you down quite a bit. Your colleague had to push you on several occasions to be flexible with your approach. There were times when your code was overly complex for what it needed to do. However, with CR feedback and mentoring, you have shown improvement. And the last one is resistance to advice. Being relatively new to Java, we thought it would have helped you to use an IDE and some of the integrations that it provides. However, you insisted that you wanted to do it all on the command line. This led to some of your struggles and likely could have helped with the speed of delivery. There were several code reviews where simply having an IDE and features like autocomplete would have helped you. Okay, I know what you're thinking, but I had a really good reason for using the command line. So the desktop machines that we were using, at least the one that I had, only had 4 gigabytes of RAM. And for the development process of the service, everything we did was actually in a virtual machine. So we didn't really do much development on our desktops. We did the development in the virtual machine. And the reason for this was it needed to be standardized. And a lot of the services were extremely complex with tons of settings and stuff. So it made more sense to just standardize it in a virtual machine, and then you can copy the virtual machine around. Now, for our service in particular, Amazon Redshift, the software stack was actually multiple distributed systems. So we had to launch a large number of different services that make up all of Redshift inside of the virtual machine. And the main problem that I had with trying to develop in the IDE is it used too much memory. And I can't tell you how many times I was trying to do the development in the IDE, but my machine would run out of memory and it would just kill the virtual machine. And it's not like you just quickly restart this thing. So if I wanted to restart my computer and start up this whole distributed system again in the virtual machine, it would take as much as like 30 minutes to do a reboot. And in my case, I wasted so much time with the virtual machine running out of memory and crashing. I just decided, you know what, I'll just do it all in the command line. And after that, I never had another out of memory crash. Okay, so that's it for the performance reviews, but I haven't quite explained yet why exactly I chose to reject the offer. So I've got a few of my own notes here that I'll go through. So for me, one of the biggest issues with working there was the overall atmosphere. There was basically no social interaction at all, pretty much total isolation all the time. I guess that's kind of good because it's quiet and you can get work done. But when you think about life longer term, about becoming part of a community, building friendships, professional networking, all that stuff, this really was not an environment that was conducive to that. And if you read a lot of networking guides, they'll say things like, oh, you should keep in touch with your colleagues and stuff, and before you leave, get some contact information. And I actually did do that at Amazon. I tried to keep in touch with people, but everybody just works so much, and the security is also very high as well. Early on in my first internship, our team actually did have lunch together for a while. And that was something that I really looked forward to. Even though we pretty much only talked about work and programming and, on-call work and stuff like that, it was still interesting to have some kind of human interaction. I remember everyone was very stressed out all the time. Everyone had this kind of blank 1,000-yard stare. There was always some kind of sense of impending doom. There was some massive, huge problem we had to fix immediately. Of course, that environment's good for getting a lot of work done, but it's not a really good social environment. And because everyone was always distracted with internal thoughts, trying to figure out, why were there so many sub-2 last night, or what is causing this bug in production, it's really not an environment for small talk. The only conversations you have there are about work topics, which is actually fine with me, but towards the end of my last internship, there was almost no interaction between anyone on the team. In fact, one of my team members got so busy, he actually just booked one single meeting room, and he completely stopped going to his desk. He just stayed in that one meeting room, and nobody knew where he was. He did get a lot of work done, though. I was also working in Seattle, and Seattle is kind of depressing. It rains all the time there. Some people have told me that they like the weather in Seattle, but I don't get it. Now, people will say that, work is not everything, and you got to get out more, and you got to go to events and all that stuff. And I actually did go to a bunch of networking events, but the issue is that there are so many engineers that work at Amazon in Seattle that if you go to a networking event, you'll meet a lot of engineers who work at Amazon, because they all have the exact same idea as me. I really did not find it to be a good place to meet people. And I talked before about the colleague who would always try and publicly insinuate that sitting around all day waiting for his help or waiting for him to explain to me how the code worked. He did that in a pretty obvious way on more than one occasion. And that's one of those things that makes you not really want to hang around with someone. Now, I will say that he was probably one of the most productive people on that team. So he was one of those people who was just churning out features left and right and, worked until midnight. And I almost forgot to talk about the on-call work. So as an intern, I did not do any on-call work, thankfully. But working there, I got to see what the on-call work was actually like. And there were some periods where the full-time people would say they would get like 10 Sev2s every night. So they'd have to wake up at like 2 a.m. and fix a bunch of bugs in production. And their pager would be constantly going off. And so they'd basically be up all night long working on the product. And then they would come into work and they're half expected to still do work during the day. And there were some periods where it got just totally absurd. People were basically, there was basically no separation between work and non-work time. So they would basically just sleep between getting Sev2s and then either do work or just wake up and respond to Sev2s when their pager went off. Now, I talked to someone else who was on a different team, and they said that they did on-call, but they basically never got paged anything. But this is how it was on my team. Another interesting fact was that the lights would shut off at 7 p.m. And there was one Saturday that I recall when my entire team was there at like 8 p.m. on a Saturday night, all working in the dark. Another thing that happened a few times was when I'd push to production, I'd be super tense that, maybe I'm going to break something or I'm going to cause a Sev2. And in a couple of situations, I'd push to production and I'd hear the beeper of my colleague start to go off and think, oh, geez, I hope I didn't break something. But it was actually just a coincidence. And to comment further on the topic of isolation and working all the time, if you check the Wikipedia page for Amazon Redshift, you will note that it launched on February 15th. Now, if you think about that for a second, you will realize that the day before February 14th is a very important day for certain people. And I was actually there. I was personally working on Redshift on February 14th. Now, that was a very busy day, and I actually wasn't doing a lot of the work myself, but I got to see what the full-times were doing. And the full-time staff made a lot of comments about how amusing it was that they had to stay until, basically like 1 or 2 in the morning on Valentine's Day. And stuff like this has made me think that maybe these companies want you to be alone and single. I mean, it makes a lot more sense. If you have no opportunity to develop social connections outside of work, then you'll probably just work all the time. Another interaction that didn't leave a good impression on me was I had a full-time colleague who tried to coerced me into doing a enum update to the production database. So I was doing some database changes that were going to be released to production. And because this process is a lot of work and it takes time, takes a few days to get managers to approve it. He wanted me to add this supposedly simple enum update to my database changes, and so that would allow him to deploy his future code changes that rely on it a lot faster. Now, the process of changing the enum involved dropping the enum constraint and then re-adding the enum constraint. And if you do that operation on a test database that doesn't have a lot of data in it, that'll go pretty quick. But if you try to do that on a production database that has, millions of records, when you re-add that enum constraint, it's going to go through and check every single record in that column to make sure it actually complies with the constraint. And if you do that change on the production database, that could lock the table while it's performing that enum constraint check. And I have no idea how long that could take. Now, the full-timer really wanted me to make this change, so he pleaded with me to do it, but I kept trying to convince him that maybe you should do it in your own chain set. Another interesting interaction that I had was when I was called into a meeting with my manager's manager about the SNS notifications. Now, if I recall correctly, my manager and my manager's manager were both invited to this meeting, but I guess they chose not to show up. And throughout this entire meeting, they were just reviewing the current state of this SNS notifications feature. And this meeting was one of the first times I got a look at some of the public documentation that was going to be for how to use this feature. And the responsibility of the documentation was falling onto me. And the documentation was actually written by another full-time who I actually didn't interact with him much. Apparently this guy specialized in writing docs, but he was retiring soon, and I think he was pretty much checked out because looking at this documentation, it was totally full of spelling errors. There were all kinds of tables that had totally broken formatting, and a lot of this meeting was my manager's manager grilling me about all the mistakes in spelling errors in this documentation. Another interaction that left a bad taste in my mouth was in order to actually complete this SNS notifications feature, there were a lot of details about how exactly this feature would work that no one had specified. Now, the project manager was supposed to do this, but he was incredibly busy. And since I was under pressure to deliver this feature, I just said, well, I'll just make up some reasonable details here, and I'll schedule a meeting with the project manager, and I'll just say, hey, this is how this feature is going to be. Is that okay with you? And then if he wants to suggest changes, then I'll just do whatever he wants. So I scheduled a meeting with this project manager, and as soon as this meeting started, my manager, who was not invited to this meeting, showed up and started asking the project manager a whole bunch of totally unrelated questions. And so I let him go for a while, but eventually time was running out in the meeting, and this project manager was it was really hard to corner him, so I had to ask these questions. And so eventually I had to start interrupting my manager to try and actually get the questions asked so that I could know how to build this feature. So this here is my Amazon leadership principles sheet. And in theory, I basically agree with all these leadership principles. But if there's one thing I would have liked to see more of, it would be the ownership leadership principle. One of the things it says under the ownership leadership principle is that they never say, that's not my job. One of the observations I have is that that leadership principle is used to a fault. It seems to be used by a lot of people who themselves don't want to take ownership. If you don't want to take ownership for something, just try to give it to someone else. And then if they say, that's not my job, then you could say, you're not embodying the leadership principles. And that issue is something I saw a lot of. Another big issue that I had was with how risk and responsibility is handled. So we were almost always under very tight deadlines to deliver results. And my manager would ask for estimates. He would say, how long is it going to take you to do this? I'd say something like 2 weeks. He'd say, can you do it in 1 week? And I would say, it is possible to do in 1 week, but we'll have to cut corners. For example, we might not be able to test things as much, or we'll have to do something in a way where we don't have complete information. So you can always get stuff done faster if you take a little bit more risks. There's really a cost-benefit analysis you can do. And in these interactions that I would have with my manager, I would say, yes, we could do it this way or that way, and there are certain risks associated with that. Do you think that these are acceptable risks to take? And the response that I would always get would be some sort of avoidance. And I came to realize that this is probably a deliberate thing. So that way you can keep it ambiguous who bears the responsibility for taking these risks. This way, the management can push people and coerce people into taking significant risks. And this way, when the risk doesn't work out, you can blame it on the employee. And as the employee working in this ambiguous situation, you know that you're going to have to go above and beyond, and you're probably going to have to work late, work weekends to try and avoid that risky scenario. Now, Amazon has a lot of really high-profile clients, and the idea of always being coerced into cutting corners and taking risks is not something I found really appealing. Now, of course, it's just part of being a professional that sometimes you'll have to push back on people, but given how much pressure everyone was under and the ambiguous nature of responsibility, I decided this was really not an environment for me. Another interesting fact was, near the end of my internship, I found out that some people that I worked with didn't even know that I was an intern, and they were surprised when I said I was going back to school. I did hear from some other interns who said their experience was not like mine at all. So I suppose it probably depends on the team that you're on. And I portrayed this as fairly stressful, but in a way it's almost a kind of fun type of stress. I think that out of all of the software development places that I worked, Amazon was the only one that really got how to build scalable software. The scale of these systems was absolutely massive, and the database clusters that we worked with cost millions of dollars per year to operate, so the data was probably worth tens of millions, hundreds of millions. I also liked Amazon's build system, their deployment systems, the CM review process. I was told that a lot of people really didn't like this bureaucracy, but I actually thought it had a beneficial outcome on keeping the product stable. So would I recommend doing an internship at Amazon? Given the environment I described, I don't think I'd recommend working there full time for a long period, at least on the team that I worked on. I think if you were able to do it, you would do it for maybe a couple years at max, and during that time bank as much money as possible. But if you do that, the other issue is that the vesting schedule is going to be such that if you just stay a little bit longer, most of your stock options are going to come in the, I think, third and fourth years. Oh, and the other fun fact is, if I had actually accepted my job offer and stayed there for the last 10 years, I would be a multi-millionaire by now. But that would be primarily from the stock options, not from salary. Of course, this was all 10 years ago, so it might be completely different by now.